Okay. So again, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the FY22 CDBG and CARES Act RFQ, Request for Qualification Workshop. Again, my name's Leonardo Alarcon. I'm a project specialist in the Economic Development Department. I don't see any other staff members except Michelle. So I'm gonna introduce Michelle.
Hi everyone, my name is Michelle Morano. I am a Community Development Coordinator with the Economic Development Department. You'll be hearing my voice a lot this morning, so sorry about that. But I have been working with the city for almost 18 years, and I look forward to talking to you a little bit about the Community Development Block Grant Program. And then I can kick it off. I see Lisa Fune is here in the meeting, so maybe Lisa, turn your camera on so everyone can see you and introduce yourself.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Lisa Fune. I am part of our monitoring and compliance team, and you will probably see me if you get awarded funding.
And I see Lydia Goularte too. Lydia, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hello, my name is Lydia Goularte. I am with the Housing and Fair Housing Division of CDD. I oversee the fair housing contract and the homeless contracts. So you'll only see me if when it's time to do your fair housing training.
And then maybe later on, as more of our staff logs on, we can introduce them towards the end of the session as well.
Yeah, sounds good. So one thing, I'll let all the participants know that I am right now going to ask everyone to mute themselves. There is going to be sections where you guys can submit some questions. So as Michelle is going through the presentation, just submit a question in the chat box, and then as we have our breaks, we will kind of go through those questions. Okay. So let me see. Oh, did I mute you, Michelle?
I'm unmuted. Do you want me to start sharing my screen?
Yeah, I think we are good to go because I don't see any other staff folks on here.
Oh, there's Shirley and Mike just jumped on too. Maybe they can introduce themselves before we get started.
Okay. Mike and Shirley, can you guys introduce yourselves, please?
Oops, Shirley's muted.
Let me.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Oh, there you go.
Hi, hello, my name is Shirley Reed. I'm Supervising Management Analyst, and I manage the Fiscal Operations Division for the Economic Development Department.
And Mike might be.
Mike's here. Mike's here. Sorry, everyone. I love technology at 10 o'clock on a Monday morning. Some of you have had the pleasure to work with me. I am Mike Wynn. I drive all of you nuts with the ED grant system. So I apologize profusely for being the source of your sorrow, but I very much look forward to working closely with many of you this year. And I wish you the best of luck as we kick off our process. Thank you.
And then Letitia, are you able to unmute yourself and introduce yourself? I saw that you were logged in as well. Sounds like maybe no. So maybe we can get Letitia later.
Yeah.
Well, we'll go ahead and get started. I'll share my screen. Hopefully this will work. Yay. Get to see my fancy notes. Can everyone see my screen? I see some heads nodding, so I will go ahead and get started. Well, Again, thank you all for joining us for this session on the Community Development Block Grant Program and the upcoming RFQ. Again, an RFQ is a request for qualifications. Again, my name is Michelle Morano. I'm a Community Development Coordinator with the City of San Diego. And just before we get started, I just wanted to go through a couple housekeeping items. As you have questions, if you could type those in the chat section, that would be very helpful for us. We'll pause throughout some of the presentation, just at various times throughout the presentation to answer questions. So as you have them, if you want to type them in, that'd be beautiful. It also helps us because at the end, we're able to keep track of those questions, and anything that we didn't get a chance to answer, we can go ahead and try to answer those in our FAQs that we post online in our ED Grants FAQ tab, and we'll show you where that is in the future. And then also, just so you know, some of the slides break every rule of presentations. They're very text heavy, a lot of detail. That's really so that when you have the opportunity to go back and look at the slides once we post them online, you'll have the resources available to you to click on websites or handbooks or things like that. So don't try to, don't worry about trying to take notes or trying to jot down everything you see. This presentation will be available to you online after the session, probably by the close of business today, but if not, by tomorrow morning. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. I'm monitoring two different sessions here. So today you're going to learn about the mission, vision, and goals of the city, some basics about CDBG. And again, CDBG stands for Community Development Block Grants. Our grant application process, some of the prerequisites for applying for CDBG funds, eligible projects. So as you begin to apply for funds, you're going to want to be thinking about what type of projects you would be proposing and if they are eligible for these funds. Some tips and tricks for successful presentations, and then also what are the next steps in this process. So just very briefly, the city has a strategic plan and all of our investments are guided by this plan. There's an overarching mission of the city. It's basically the city's reason for being, why we exist, and it's to effectively serve and support our communities. And then our vision statement is, what do we want to be as a city? What do we want to become? And we want to become a world-class city for all. So all activities taken by the city, including how we invest our funds, are aligning with this mission and with this vision. The goals of the city are to provide high quality public services, work in partnership with all of our communities to achieve safe and livable neighborhoods, and to create and sustain a resilient, economically prosperous city. So we couldn't provide world-class services to our residents without partners like you as your nonprofit organizations. And then our values are, they spell out PIES, people, oh my goodness, integrity, excellence, and service. Then our economic development department goal is to cultivate economic and community development opportunities that serve businesses, neighborhoods, and residents. We cannot serve the city as a department on our own. And so again, this is why we seek out partnerships with nonprofit organizations to help us deliver services to our communities. So as we're going through the RFQ requirements, we do want you to kind of consider your potential projects and keep this question in mind. How does your organization's mission align with the city's goals? And consider not only the specific requirements of the request for qualifications that we're going to talk about, the request for proposals that we're going to talk about, but also how your organization fits within our city's goals and mission. So now we're going to move on to the request for qualification phase and why the city has it in the first place. And we are talking about, before we get started on this, we're talking about two different NOFAs now. So there's the traditional CDBG annual NOFA that some of you have seen year after year after year. And then we're also going to be talking about a And then again, a NOFA is a notice of funding availability. That's going to be dedicated primarily to the CARES Act funds that we've received. So there are going to be 2 parallel NOFAs running this year. And we're going to talk about a little bit how we're going to process those. But I just wanted to start the conversation out with you all knowing that there are 2. One related to CDBG generally, and then one related to the CARES Act, which is specifically meant to provide funding for services that prevent, prepare for, or respond to the COVID-19 emergency. So again, this PowerPoint will be available on our ED Grants Resources page as well as our CDBG webpage. We've also developed a handbook for you. It's very detailed and it provides you with guidance for how to complete a request for qualifications response. There are screenshots in the handbook for the ED Grants portal, and then sample questions as well as guidance for you. So this will be available as well. And so as we get started, the CDBG program, the primary objective of it is to improve the living environment, expand economic opportunities, and provide decent housing. But one thing that is key is that it's meant to target low and moderate income populations or neighborhoods. It's an entitlement program. It's administered by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, and funds are allocated to the city based on a regulatory formula, and it is subject to annual federal appropriation. We historically get about $10 to $11 million annually in the federal appropriation. So our annual NOFA sequence looks a little bit like this. In the summer and fall, we issue a request for qualifications, and it is a competitive process. There are 2 general phases, the request for qualifications and the request for proposals. And so we are now coming up on the request for qualifications portion or phase of the process. And this is our general timeline, just a very, very quick overview of what this looks like. So we'll be releasing the RFQ for both the fiscal year 22 CDBG as well as the CARES Act funds at the end of, actually the end of this week. And then organizations will be determined to be qualified or not qualified. That's after you would submit your responses in October. Qualified organizations are then invited to participate in the RFP process. The RFP is going to be released in November-ish, and responses will be due to the city and ED grants. Our Consolidated Plan Advisory Board will be reviewing proposals for the fiscal year 22 CDBG NOFA. City Council then approves the CDBG allocations in the spring, usually around March or April. And we add all projects in our annual action plan. The CDBG awarded projects then begin to develop their scopes, their budgets in the April, May, June timeframe, and agreements are executed. And then July 1st, 2021 would be when these applications would begin their contract term. And that's when reporting requirements would begin for your projects. So as I mentioned before, there's a 2-phase process, an RFQ and an RFP. The request for qualifications is really us as an organization, as a city, determining if your applicant organization is ready to contract with the city. Do you have the fiscal capacity to do so? What is your organizational character? And then when we get to the RFP process, we're looking at very specific program and project terms. What are you proposing to do with the funds that you will be awarded? Some of the questions that we're asking in the RFQ you'll see is, what are we looking for? Can we partner with you as an organization? What is your organizational capacity? Do you have both programmatic capacity and fiscal capacity? What's your past experience or track record delivering services, and especially delivering services to low and moderate income populations? What type of controls do you have in place? And how do your goals and mission align with the city's? We'll be asking you in the RFQ for your address and contact information, your board of directors, a general description and locations of programs, projects, and services that you've implemented in the past, the types of communities and clients that you serve, and what's your mission statement. So kind of straightforward information. We think the RFQ is pretty straightforward. Some of the registration and status requirements that will be required to be documented in the request for qualifications response are listed on this slide. They include the articles of incorporation, so your articles of incorporation for your organization. We will ask you for a copy of those. IRS employer identification numbers, a copy of your federal tax determination letter from the IRS, also your state tax determination letter. Your organization will also be required to have a DUNS number, which is a unique identifier. The federal government uses this number to track how federal money is being allocated. And so not only will you need to have a DUNS number, but that DUNS number will need to be registered at the website sam.gov. And then finally, your organization will also be required to be registered with the Department of Justice Registry of Trusts. So here's a little bit more detail on the DUNS number. There are some resources there. It can take a little time for you to get a DUNS number if you don't have one already. So you might want to plan accordingly since we're releasing our RFQ on Friday. If you do not have a DUNS number, I would definitely recommend as soon as this presentation is over, you register for one. I do also want to note that the DUNS number requirement is being phased out by the federal government. And so by the time we start contracting with you, there may actually be a new requirement for a unique identifying number is what it's being called. The federal government is still working out if they're going to automatically assign everyone who's registered in sam.gov with a number, or if they're going to ask everyone to register, get a new number, and then apply for registration with sam.gov. Again, that's not really related to the RFQ. Right now, the DUNS number is still required. It's still required to be in sam.gov. I just kind of wanted to inoculate you to the idea that you might have to get a whole new number by the time July rolls around of next year. And then these are some resources for you with the other registration requirements. So you will be asked to register with these sites, as I mentioned before. You'll also need to have these statuses. So if you register with the Secretary of State, your status needs to be active. If you register with the Attorney General's Registry of Charitable Trusts, your status needs to be current. So it's helpful for you to check your status now. It's an annual registration for some of these websites. And so you just want to make sure that you're current or active before you start to apply for your RFQ. Some of the registrations like the debarment list, we need to check as a city to make sure that your organization isn't in any trouble with the federal government. So we want to make sure that you're not on that list so that we can grant award funds to you. And then some additional notes here. The website for sam.gov does include a step-by-step instruction on how to register. The renewal can take 7 to 10 days. So if you've allowed your DUNS number to lapse, just kind of keep that timeline in mind that you want to make sure that you get those up to date as quickly as possible. Some RFQ internal controls that we're looking for. We're not going to ask you for copies of your documents at this point. It's more of a checklist for you in the RFQ. And we're really looking at what your contents of your written policies have. So what are your written policies for financial controls? And what are your written policies for procurement? The RFQ is going to request an overview of your internal controls and methods. And the main point is that no single person should have the sole authority over all steps of a financial or budget transaction. So if funded, we will be asking applicants to provide a copy of your internal procedures to ensure that separation of duties are documented by your organizational chart, position descriptions that include financial management responsibilities, and also a clear written procedures that designate and delegate the roles of authority in all financial and budget approval processes. So some weaknesses that we can identify through this process is that maybe your accounting policies and procedures are written using vague job descriptions instead of very specific descriptions. Maybe your policies and procedures don't include control over access to assets or forms and sensitive documents, or approval authority for financial transactions. Maybe your expenditures aren't separated by funding source. We want to make sure you have a fringe benefit policy, that your policies and procedures are updated routinely, that you have a very specific way that you're estimating your indirect costs or administrative overhead. We want to make sure your expenditures are separated by funding source so that we can appropriately track our federal funds from other funds that you may be receiving. We also want to see that you're keeping good timesheets and time calculations, especially if you're being reimbursed for payroll or fringe with our funds. And I just lost. Goodness, sorry guys. Right. And then with procurement methods, I'm going to find my notes. Bear with me. My computer was not being friendly with me today. All right. So with regard to procurement, there is a federal guidelines. It's federal section 2 Code of Federal Regulations subpart D 200-302, and that's also in our resources for you. Don't have to memorize that now, but it does have general procurement standards and methods to be followed, and that's also in subpart D. And the methods of procurement include a micro purchase, small purchases, sealed bid, competitive proposals, and non-competitive proposals. Those are also outlined in your handbooks, both the RFQ handbook as well as our operating manual. So we do have an annual operating manual. Once you are once you've executed a contract with us, these processes are described in that manual. Basically, a micro purchase is for the purchase of, I think the last time I checked was for $3,000 or less, but that may have been increased due to the CARES Act. So we'll check on that by the time you have a contract executed. But right now, micro purchases are for purchases of $3,000 or less. Small purchases are about $150,000 or less. And then anything over that would fall within the remaining 3 procurement processes. So weaknesses there may be that you don't have federal award experience or you don't have a written procurement method in place. So those are things that we're looking at in the RFQ process. Some certifications you'll be required to submit with the RFQ. You'll need to certify compliance with certain federal requirements, including what's on this slide, so that you're not lobbying for political gain. You're not on a disbarment, a suspension, or ineligibility list. You have a drug-free workplace. You agree to comply with the Civil Rights Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act. Also that you have a conflict of interest and procurement policies in place. You'll be clicking on boxes in the RFQ to certify your compliance with these certifications. And then should you be awarded funding, your board of directors will also confirm the certifications and the action of the individual certifying on behalf of your organization. So your board will give authority to the individual who is submitting this application to certify on behalf of the organization. These certifications are legally binding on your organization, and the RFQ handbook also provides a complete list of the additional documents that you will be asked to provide, including org charts and determination letters. There's also a fiscal requirement in the RFQ, and this is really the meat of the RFQ, honestly. It's that in order to successfully complete this process, you'll be asked to submit your board-approved audited financial statements for the most recently ended fiscal year. For most of your organizations, the most recently ended fiscal year with a completed audited financial statement will be the one that ended June of 2019. We don't anticipate organizations to have their audits completed for the year that just ended June of 2020. If you're on a calendar year, that would again be for the fiscal year ending December of 2019. And this is a non-negotiable requirement. So the audited financial statements, there will essentially be two types based on your specific funding situation. If you spent more than $750,000 in federal funds in a year, you will be required to submit a specific or single audit for your most recently completed fiscal year. If you did not do that, when most nonprofits have not spent more than $750,000 in a fiscal year, so then you'll be required to submit an audited financial statement again for your most recently completed fiscal year. It's an unqualified, unmodified opinion. And this will help determine how much in CDBG funds you can ask for in your RFP, in your request for proposals. So what we're looking for is your cash balance in this audited financial statement. And again, it has to be your cash balance. We're looking at that, and then we use that to determine what is the maximum funding amount that you can receive. So we're looking at the cash balance to determine the maximum funding amount that you can receive. How we do that is we take your cash balance and we multiply that by 4, because there are 4 3-month quarters in the year. And that results in the maximum amount that you can request. And you'll be provided that amount in your notification letter if you're determined to be qualified through the RFQ. So once we've gone through the request for qualifications, we've looked at all of your documentation, we've looked at your audit, it satisfies the requirements, you'll be notified that you are qualified to apply for an RFP, and this dollar amount, whatever that maximum funding amount is, will be included in your letter. So you'll know what you're able to request. And then we'll talk a little bit more about the last two points on this slide, that this applies to all of your organization's RFP responses, and it's limited by the overall budget. So by saying limited by the overall budget for each RFP category. So let's say you're an organization that has $1 million in cash balance. So that means that you could request up to $4 million of funds. Well, a lot of our budgets for our RFPs aren't up to $4 million. So let's say you want to submit a public service request. Our public service budget is about $600,000. So even though you have the capacity to request $4 million, it's limited by the budget of the RFP. So you can't request $4 million in a category that we only have $600,000 to give. So that's why that clarification is there. And then also this applies to all of your organization's responses. So if you have a public service that you'd like to propose, if you have in the future even a CARES Act related, COVID emergency related public service you'd like to propose, and maybe a facility improvement, and you're that same organization, so you can propose up to $4 million. It's not $4 million per category, it's $4 million cumulatively. So your public services, your CARES Act, your capital improvement, your facility improvement couldn't exceed that $4 million limit. We'll have time for questions in just a second. So again, why do we do that? Why are we looking at your cash balance and requiring that you have that capacity. And really it's because our community development block grants work on a reimbursement basis. And so your organization is fronting the cost for these services. And we want to make sure that you have enough cash flow that you can meet your expenditure requirements to continue to fulfill your project while you're waiting for reimbursement from the city. So how that works is month 1, July 1st, you're under contract. You are starting to work. You're starting to spend funds on your program from July 1st through July, the end of July. Then month 2, August, is when you would submit your request for reimbursement to the city. So that usually happens around the 15th of August. So you're already starting in August operations. You still have not received funds from the city yet. We review the request for reimbursement. We're looking at your receipts. We say, yes, your expenses were eligible. The payment will happen within 30 days from the date of the invoice. So usually it's month 3 before you're going to see the reimbursement for month 1. So in September, you'll be receiving payment for July 1st. And so that's why we are looking at your cash balance to make sure you have the capacity to continue to operate until you receive reimbursements from us. So some common disqualifiers in the request for qualifications process are that an incorrect audit certificate may have been submitted, or you don't submit your specific or single audit when it's required to be there. Or maybe your audited financial statements weren't submitted at all, or they don't meet the requirements. Or you're on the state of California or federal debarment list, or even that you've selected the wrong RFQ track. So like I mentioned before, we are going to have 2 tracks or 2 NOFAs this year. So let's say, for example, you want to apply for a COVID-related project. You have a COVID-related project in mind, and you don't necessarily qualify for the minimum funding threshold, which I'll talk below, at $50,000, but you do at $25,000 because the CARES Act will be at $25,000 as a minimum. But you submit under your public services regular CDBG category. That would eliminate you from the NOFA because you didn't meet the minimum funding threshold for $50,000. So I guess I should have mentioned that before I started giving you that example. We are checking for your funding request threshold, and at least $50,000, you have to have that capacity in order to qualify for any of our regular fiscal year 22 CDBG funds. For the CARES Act, we have reduced that to $25,000 so we can help smaller organizations. So that means that your cash balance for the regular fiscal year 22 applications, your cash balance on your audited financial statements needs to be $12,500 or more. And then for the CARES Act, your cash balance needs to be $6,250. So that's really going to help you determine which NOFA that you're applying under. And again, you can apply for both if you have that capacity. But if you're one of those smaller organizations that maybe doesn't necessarily have the $12,500, but you do have the $6,250 in your cash balance, then you would be eligible for a CARES Act NOFA as long as your project is COVID related. So before we move on to the RFP phase, I'm going to stop. I'm going to go back and stop on this last slide. And let's take some questions maybe, if we have any.
Hi, Michelle. We do have some questions in the chat. Do you want me to read them out loud?
Sure.
So the first question is, can an organization apply for both NOFAs?
Yes.
Okay, and then the second question is, if you're submitting applications for multiple property, do you need a DUNS number, DUNS number for each property?
No, the DUNS number is related to your organization. So your organization would have one DUNS number.
And then if an organization's 501c3, the NGO requesting CDBG is part of a consolidated audit, how will the city qualify the NGO requester, the parent company versus the NGO that's requesting CDBG funds?
I'm going to kick that question to Shirley Reed or Lisa Fune if they're able to respond.
That question?
Could you repeat the question, Nadine?
Yeah, so if an organization's 501c3 is part of a consolidated audit, how will the city qualify the NGO requester? So the parent company versus the NGO requesting CDBG.
So I would say the parent company would have to be the one applying if they're the ones that are like the lead of the audit. So it's something that the NGO will have to work out with their parent company. If the parent company is okay with being like the fiscal first in the agreement, and we will qualify the whole audit, including the parent company and the NGO.
That's all we have in the chat for questions.
And then again, if we don't respond to your questions or if you have additional questions, you can continue to type them in the chat. We'll have some time at the end of the presentation. And then also at the end of the presentation, I'll talk about technical assistance appointments. So it also gives you an opportunity to ask very detailed questions about your specific situation and project. So we will continue then. So that really does continue, that concludes our RFQ discussion, honestly. The rest of the presentation is going to be a little bit more about how you plan ahead for the request for proposals phase. And it really does help you plan during the request for qualifications phase. So once you are deemed qualified through the request for qualifications, you're invited to submit a response to the RFP. And again, the maximum funding threshold will be included in your notice, so you're aware of what you're eligible to apply for. And at this point, I just want to say a few words about the ED grants system. Some of you have received funding from us in the past, you're familiar with it. You'll become very acquainted with it if you haven't applied for us in the past, for funds in the past. But it is our online grants management system, and it really is a customer relationship management solution for everything in our entire grant cycle. So we release our NOFAs through this process. All reviews and scoring is done in this online portal with our Consolidated Plan Advisory Board, which is a volunteer group of 9 individuals that review and score every single application that is submitted through our annual process. You will be submitting your responses to the RFQ and RFP through the online grant portal. Execution of agreements is handled through this. We do monitor your performance with monthly reporting and requests for reimbursement. We also conduct monitoring site visit scheduling through this. And then we're able as a department and as a city to generate program data and compliance reports with the system as well. So if you haven't already logged in and seen what it looks like, this is the link for it. And we do have step-by-step guides. You do not need to be registered in order to access the tabs at the bottom there. So if you go to this edgrants.force.com, you can click on the FAQs, the frequently asked questions tab. You can click on the resources tab without having a registration and a password. It's available to everyone. And so in the resource tab, there are 2 very specific resources. One is how to register your organization, and another is how to submit an RFQ response. Those are step-by-step screenshots on how to do that. And I would recommend that you start to register your organization now if you haven't already. And that'll give you some time to kind of maneuver in the system before we even release the RFQ at the end of this week. Our RFQ handbook will also be posted in the resources by the end of business today. And then once you do register, you will be sent a password from the ED grant system. Make sure that you check your spam or junk mail folders for this email password, because sometimes that's where it lands. So once you're qualified through the RFQ process, our CDBG program goals and objectives are going to be very important to you, because these are we have 3 foundational documents for the city CDBG program, and they do outline the goals and priorities of our program. They're posted online. The 5-year consolidated plan is a document that tells HUD what we plan to do, what we would like to accomplish with the funds we anticipate receiving from the federal government. So it's basically, we're saying to HUD what we'd like to do. Then there's an annual action plan. The annual action plan represents how we're going to do what we said. So we're telling HUD, these are the projects that are being funded this year. This is how much they are receiving. And these are the anticipated outcomes that we will achieve from granting these funds. And then finally, at the end of every year, there is a consolidated annual performance and evaluation report, or CAPER. And this is our report to HUD telling them this is what we did. We're showing HUD that we did what we said we were going to do. And so the show is reporting on what were the actual outcomes. How much did we actually spend? How much was leveraged by other funding sources? So when we're asking you as an organization to submit monthly reports and to submit monthly requests for reimbursement, all of that information is then input into this annual report to demonstrate to HUD that we as a city are effectively using the funds that we're being provided. There are 7 consolidated plan goals. Again, the consolidated plan is available on our website. But as you're thinking about projects that you would like to propose for funding, not only are you looking at the city's mission and goals and vision, but we also need to consider these goals for our community development block grant program as we're compiling our projects. And so these goals are related to affordable housing and small business and workforce development, investing in public facilities, also in assisting individuals experiencing homelessness, investing in community services for vulnerable populations, and also financing impactful nonprofit facility improvements. So as you formulate your projects, please consider those. Also, our consolidated plan has guiding strategies. It really is the lens that we are looking at proposed projects through. I don't know if that was good grammar, but anyways, there's inclusive economic growth is one, economic resiliency and sustainability, and finally, catalytic community investment. So inclusive economic growth, we're really looking at projects that help reduce poverty through better access to jobs, education, transportation, and employment support. For resilience, whether it's in the local economy, small business, or even individual households, we're trying to make investments to help recover, withstand, or avoid change in the environment. And these changes can be caused by economic downturns, loss of industry, national disasters, or even medical emergencies like the COVID-19 pandemic. So emergency programs that our city implemented in response to COVID-19, like the Small Business Relief Fund or the Rental Assistance Program, these would be considered satisfying our economic resiliency and sustainability guiding strategy. And then finally, catalytic community investments. These would be impactful projects that address needs of vulnerable populations. We really are trying to invest in projects that will help increase or improve access to services. For CDBG, one thing you'll need to know is that CDBG is a flexible program. but it is designed so that it benefits low and moderate income residents and communities. So before you decide to apply for CDBG funds, once you've successfully navigated the RFQ process, you're going to want to ensure that your proposed project is eligible for these funds. Any project must meet one of 3 national objectives, and they include urgent need, slum and blight, and low and moderate income benefit. So again, as we've talked about, urgent need is responding to a major catastrophe like a flood or an earthquake. And it really is if the community's resources can't fully meet the costs of remediating that need. So other resources have been depleted, or other federal programs may not be sufficient to cover all the costs. That's when CDBG can come in to assist with urgent need. With slum and blight, it has its roots in the urban renewal program. That was once a federal program that CDBG replaced. And it really is meant to remove dilapidated buildings and things such as that. And then finally, our program primarily focuses on benefiting low and moderate income persons. And the reason for that is that according to the federal regulations, over 70% of our funds must be spent in this area. And so we want to ensure that we are meeting that threshold for the federal government, and we focus on this as a community. So this can be satisfied by providing housing to low and moderate income households, creating or retaining jobs for low and moderate income individuals, providing access to an amenity to a defined area whose residents are at least 51% low and moderate income, and then finally providing a service to specific documented low and moderate income individuals rather to everyone in a particular area. And so that's how we can meet those requirements. There's also another method for meeting limited clientele, which is low and moderate income clients. There are certain clients that are presumed to be low and moderate income. So those would be clients that you wouldn't need to get their income qualifications for. And those are defined by federal law. And they're abused children, battered spouses, elderly persons who are age 62 and over, severely disabled adults, homeless persons, illiterate adults, persons living with AIDS, and migrant farm workers. So if your services only provide direct services to one of those categories, and that's the only client that you have, the presumed benefit category would fit your needs, and you would not need to collect demographic or income qualifications on that client base. And again, those are things that we can discuss in a technical assistance appointment, just to make sure that we have all of our bases covered. So then you're looking at part 2 of the 2-phased process. You're qualified during the RFQ, and then we're looking at the RFP. Is your project eligible for CDBG funds? During the RFP, we'll be looking at you to describe the scope of your project and your target population, the schedule of your project, the amount of funds that you'll be requesting, other funding sources that you might have available, and we do provide extra points if you do have other funds to leverage, and that we can talk about in an RFP workshop in the future, how you plan to use all the funds that you would be granted, and then documenting your readiness to deliver your project. So now I do want to speak. Actually, let's take a little break now. Are there any questions before I get into the specific funding opportunities that are available?
Yeah, there are a couple more questions in the chat that I'll read out loud.
Okay, thanks, Nate.
The first question is, what's the difference in projects between CDBG and CARES Act funding?
Okay, good question. So there are a couple very specific differences. The CARES Act funding is specifically set aside for public services only. So that's one. It will only be public services, and it'll be public services related to the COVID pandemic. So your projects proposed must either prevent, prepare for, or respond to COVID-19. And then I'll talk a little bit more about the specifics of the CARES Act application. For the regular fiscal year 22 CDBG project, there are several categories, and we're going to talk about those in the next slide. So it's not just limited to public services. So that's one difference. The other difference is the minimum requests. So for fiscal year 22 CDBG projects, the minimum that can be requested is $50,000. And that is for public service and community economic development type projects. And that's defined by Council Policy 700-02. So that's a city council policy. For facility improvements, multifamily housing improvements, the minimum that can be requested under the fiscal year 22 CDBG NOFA is $100,000. For the CARES Act NOFA, the minimum that can be requested is $25,000. So it is open to some of those smaller organizations that might not have that cash on hand in their financial audits that we talked about earlier.
Okay, next question is, does CARES Act funding also require an audit report?
I'm sorry, an audit, is that what it?
Yeah.
Yeah, yes, it will.
Okay, and then can CDBG funding, can CDBG fund revolving loan pools or just programmatic expenses?
I don't know that a revolving loan fund or a revolving loan pool would be eligible under the categories that we are funding through this NOFA. So that would be something that we might need to have a technical assistance appointment on.
Okay, thank you. And then for the last question, I think you might have answered part of this already, but for the CARES Act portion, how much funding is available? Specifically, what is the amount available to nonprofits through the RFQ process? And what is the total amount of CDBG CARES Act funding that was made available to the city of San Diego?
Ooh, okay. So for the CARES Act funding that is available through this NOFA for public services for nonprofits, it's $3.5 million that's going to be made available. There are several different sources of CARES Act funding from the city of San Diego. For CDBG, I have it on a sticky note on my computer, so I don't have it off the top of my head. I think it was, I know we just recently received 12 million in round 3, and honestly, I'm drawing a blank. I will get that to you by the end of the session. But it was, yeah, I honestly don't remember. But there have been,
Michelle.
Yeah.
Is it the original CARES Act funding for CDBG?
Yes. Yes.
So that was 7 million.
Thank you.
That we got, yeah.
Yay. Teamwork makes the dream work. Yeah. So it was, and we've used that to help capitalize the rental assistance program with the San Diego Housing Commission. Also funded some of the small business assistance programs and several other programs that are happening. And I'm sure at some point we will have a breakout of all of that for everyone to see, so it's transparent. Are there any other questions on that? So
there's a follow-up question.
Okay.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
So they're asking for the RFQ, RFP, it's only public services, so no capital improvement.
There will be capital improvement under the fiscal year 22 CDBG funds, so our regular entitlement funds that don't have to be related to COVID-19. There will be capital improvements, but not CARES Act funds for this NOFA.
So Michelle, this is Stacy. I just wanted to clarify because I didn't see anyone ask the question. If a project or service qualified for both the CARES Act funding and CDBG, can they apply for both for the same project?
Not likely for the same project. I would recommend if it's a public service, and it meets the COVID-19 requirements that they apply for COVID-19 for the CARES Act because there are more funds available. So that might be a technical assistance question as well. Like, are they providing two separate services? One is to prepare, prevent, and respond to COVID-19, and one is not related to COVID-19. Then potentially they could apply for both. We just have to be careful with duplication of benefits, and that'll be something that I highlight a little bit later in the slides. Thank you, Brenton. Any other questions? Okay, we're going to just move forward then with just highlighting some of the types of projects that are available or eligible under the Community Development Block Grant NOFA, so the fiscal year 22 regular CDBG NOFA, and then also the CARES Act. So the first is public services, and this would be under the regular or annual fiscal year 22 CDBG NOFA. And again, the minimum allocation is $50,000. So when your organization is thinking about applying for this, just keep in mind that your cash balance then in your audited financial statements would need to be $12,500 or more. And the types of activities are listed here on this slide. And again, we have different buckets that are available to us, and so there are different project category types. The public services is always the most competitive because that's where there's the most need. These funds go to organizations to implement services that are specific to documented low and moderate income individuals or presumed LMI individuals, rather than to everyone in a particular area or a community. It's capped at 15% of our entitlement funds, and so that's why we always have kind of this small amount that's available to us. We'd love to be able to invest all of our CDBG funds in public services, but we are capped at 15% of our entitlement. So if you think about that, if we get $10 million in entitlement in a year, 15% of that is $1.5 million. And then we do have a set aside that's required by Council Policy 700-02 to set aside $1.3 million for homeless services. And so, you know, as you can see, that gives us very little to invest in public services. Fortunately for us, for fiscal year 21, the CARES Act did waive that cap, and that's why we're able to invest so much more, like the $3.5 million that I talked about in public services this year. Additional notes, let's see. Yeah, I think the anticipated budget for public services, and don't hold me to this right now, but it's looking like it'll be about $600,000. And that budget will be something that we'll have defined by the time the RFPs are released in late October, early November. But these are the types of activities that are available: employment training, senior services, health services, mental health counseling, food banks, meal distribution. And again, you will be required to document the income levels of the individuals you're serving if they're not presumed benefit, and also complete demographic data on your clients. And these are some examples of public services we funded in the past, Mama's Kitchen, meal delivery services, and Reality Changers, youth college prep services. The other types of projects that are eligible for CDBG are community economic development. And so again, that's $50,000 minimum. And this is primarily for micro enterprise technical assistance. When we say micro enterprise, we mean that's a business that has 5 employees or less, including the owner. And this is really to provide technical assistance to help businesses get up and running. You would also be tracking the income level and demographics of the client you're serving, as well as the business that you're establishing or expanding. And this is an example of some assistance that Acción provided to a small business offering yoga and fitness classes. Another eligible expenditure are public facilities and multifamily housing. So these are the two types of nonprofit improvement projects that can be funded with CDBG. And we do have them in separate categories. So a nonprofit can either improve its facility, as long as it's serving clients there, or a multifamily housing development that it may own. Again, the minimum allocation here is $100,000. So your cash balance and your audited financial statements will need to be $25,000 or more in order to qualify for these types of projects. And there, I won't go through all the eligibility of the types of construction that is available, but they're listed here on this slide. And then here are some examples of facilities and, well, facilities projects that were used with CDBG funds, like Troyes Creek restoration for the Jacobs Center and adding a CT scanning suite to a project by La Maestra. Now, with regard to the CARES Act funds, this is the new stuff that folks probably haven't heard in the past. But there are $3.5 million in CARES Act funds for additional public services funds through fiscal year 21 that we are able to use for this NOFA. The CARES Act was passed at the end of March by the federal government, and then at the end of May, City Council did approve that we were able to use these $3.5 million for public service grants. And to help our nonprofit partners efficiently use their time, and also for our staff to allocate resources wisely, we're releasing the NOFA for the CARES Act and the fiscal year 22 CDBG requirements at the same time. So hopefully it helps the process where you're not having to gather documents twice. You'll still have to submit them twice, but it won't be two separate timelines for you all. And again, I don't think I can say this enough, but these funds do have to be used to prepare for, or respond to the impacts of the COVID-19 emergency. And really how we define that is going to be, in the narrative of your request for proposals once you're qualified. It will be up to you to determine and confirm for us how your projects will satisfy that requirement. And then to further expedite the review process, we've defined 5 eligible public service categories that will be eligible under this NOFA. And this will allow us to award the CARES Act funding by the end of January, rather than going through the scoring process with the CPAB and awarding funds in July. So it gets these critical funds deployed into our communities much more quickly. The goal is to try to do that 6 months earlier than what we would do otherwise. And so because of that, there are only 5 eligible activities that we're going to be looking at under this NOFA, and I'll talk about those in the next slide. And then lastly, I do want to highlight that there are, because these are relief funds, there is a requirement that we do not duplicate benefits with other relief programs. So an organization wouldn't be able to use CARES Act funds for costs that are already covered by other relief programs. So a good example of that would be the payroll protection program that was offered by the Small Business Administration. So if your organization received the PPP program funds, these CARES Act funds wouldn't also be able to be used for salaries and wages unless it can be defined as a separate employee, or the PPP program only met up to a certain threshold and there's still a gap in the funds needed. So we would have to demonstrate that before we would be able to fund something that's already been funded by another relief program. So the 5 types of services that we're talking about are healthcare services, senior services, childcare, educational access or bridging the digital divide, food banks, and meal distribution. So those will be the 5 eligible categories under the CARES Act Public Services. So again, if you have other public services that you would like to propose, then they would go under the fiscal year 22 CDBG NOFA. And then our resources that are available, we have the operating manual for this fiscal year, so you can kind of see what we require as far as reporting, so you kind of know what you're getting into before you apply for these funds. Then there are the financial management internal control requirements that I mentioned earlier, and always our ED grants resources tab that's available to you. And then finally, if you're not on the CDBG mailing list, I definitely recommend that you subscribe to the mailing list. You can click on this live link once you get a copy of the presentation, and you'll be notified of all of our workshops, trainings, when deadlines are coming up, when we're having our CPAB meetings, all of that information. It will really help you stay informed. And then one other thing I did want to highlight before we kind of start questions again is the insurance requirements for contracting with the city. This is something that can kind of be a surprise because there is a cost associated with these insurance coverages. And so we want to make sure that you're aware of them now. This would be something that would be required by the time we enter into a contract with you. So it's not required by the time you submit your RFQ. But before we can enter into a contract, these would be the coverages that would be required. And we want you to be aware of them now. You can include these in your budgets. So the annual costs can be included as part of your eligible expenses for your projects. But they're listed here. Again, insurers with an AM best rating of no less than an A-VI would be, or A-6 would be required. And then the endorsements would need to cover the city, its officials, officers, agents, employees, and volunteers as additional insured. We do have resources available in ED grants about these requirements. And so it would be something that would be as simple as sending the samples to your insurance broker to make sure that you're covered, and also find out what additional costs might be associated with that. So you can kind of prepare for that now. And then just some tips and tricks, like we said, register your organization in ED grants early so that you're not trying to register the day before the RFQ is due. Choose one person to be the lead contact for your organization. That's always very helpful because we'll have an assigned project manager for you. So if one person is communicating with another one person, it's very helpful. Also, take advantage of the handbook and the FAQs and the resources that are available to you. We've tried to anticipate your questions and make the answers available to you so that you have them quickly. But that being said, if you do have questions, don't hesitate to email us at the cdbg@sandiego.gov email address. We are here to help. And I do want to highlight that using that address is incredibly helpful to us. We know some of you have worked with other staff members specifically in the past. You have our personal email addresses, but using this one helps us keep track of the questions that are coming in. And if we're getting the same question over and over again, it helps us identify how we can improve the materials that we're offering to you all. So if you could please use that cdbg@sandiego.gov email. That helps us do that for one. And then also it helps you get a response more quickly. If you're sending emails to me directly and I'm in a meeting or I'm giving a presentation, I might not be able to get a response to you, but there are other colleagues that I'm working with that are checking that CDBG at sandiego.gov email, and they can respond to you more quickly. So it helps you, and it also helps us. Some other tips and tricks, take advantage of opportunities for technical assistance and office hours. Nothing breaks my heart more than to have an organization get disqualified in the RFQ or in the RFP process for something that we could have very quickly and easily addressed in technical assistance appointment and help them move forward. So please take advantage of those. We'll have 30-minute sessions available one-on-one virtually, and we will have a doodle poll for scheduling those times available by the end of business today or tomorrow. It'll be on our website, so keep an eye out for that. And they'll start, I believe, October 2nd, and they'll run for about 2 weeks. Also start the process early to give yourself enough time to review your application and review the required documents before submission. Again, it's really hard to get it all together within 24 hours or even the day of the submittal deadline. So definitely recommend you try to get started as quickly as possible. And then also have someone proofread your application documents. And this is something that we've heard time and time again from our Consolidated Plan Advisory Board that are reviewing the applications. I'm not going to blame anyone for cutting and pasting from one application to the next, but just make sure you're using the right city name in your application. We've had that in the past. Also, make sure, see if there's someone in your family or a neighbor that could read the application. I know in our line of work, we use acronyms and we assume that everyone knows what we're talking about. So it's helpful to have someone who is not familiar with your work read your application and see if they understand what you're trying to say. And then finally, only the primary representative can submit an application. So what's a primary representative? I didn't really highlight that. We have 2 representatives that are eligible to enroll in our ED grants portal. There's a primary representative, and that'll be someone who's authorized by your board who can legally bind your organization. And then there's a secondary representative, and that individual can be the one who's putting all the details in your application or submitting your demographics or submitting your outcomes on the annual basis or monthly basis. But it's only the primary representative that has the ability to submit anything through the ED grants portal. So just keep that in mind. We've had instances where the secondary representative has all of the RFQ uploaded, ready to go, can't find the submit button, and that's because they don't have access to the submit button. Only the primary representative does. And then the primary representative has lost their password or has, is on a cruise. And so we just want to make sure that when the deadline comes around, you and your primary representative are aware of how to submit the application. So yeah, so requesting CDBG funds is a lot of rules, a lot of information, but we just take a deep breath. We want you to have fun in delivering your projects and assisting the community that is in so much need of our help at this point. But definitely there are rules to follow. So the timeline is, again, our workshop today. We're planning to release the RFQ this Friday. Technical assistance appointments will be available October 2nd through the 16th. RFQ's responses will be due in ED grants on October 23rd. You'll be notified of your qualified or not qualified determinations by November 6th. We will be releasing the RFP to qualified organizations on the 9th, and then responses will be due before the holidays on the 18th of December. We hope to notify CARES Act grants only of their awards by the 22nd of January so that we can begin to deploy those as quickly as possible. And then the notifications of scoring and ranking would be posted on March 5th. So again, the CPAB would have to, the Consolidated Plan Advisory Board would have to score and rank all of the fiscal year 22 CDBG applications. Those rankings would be posted in March. And then we do have to take those to City Council for approval and include those in our annual action plan for contracting July 1st. And with that, we're here to assist you. I definitely want to be available for questions and technical assistance. And I think we can take questions now. Is there any more?
Yeah, Michelle, could you show the slides again that show the 5 eligible activities for CARES Act funding? Thank you. We have a question on health and safety hazards. Would you be able to give some specific examples of what this might include or has included in the past?
Health and safety hazards. Would this be for housing improvements, or would this be for care, COVID related?
Nonprofit CIPs.
Yeah.
Nonprofit CIPs. It could be anything that's been identified as a code violation. I mean, that would be one thing. If there are, I'm drawing a blank. Does anyone from our capital improvements team want to take that? I mean, definitely code violations, if
I can give some examples, Michelle.
Thank you.
Some examples could be like roof leaking, anything that will prevent you from providing safe services to your clients. If you've got flooring where you don't want clients tripping over anything. So things like that. Again, we're looking at how the clients are using your facility. That's how we determine safety hazards, health and safety hazards.
Thank you, Lisa.
This question is the total pool available for nonprofit public facilities category known?
Not at this time. It would be very similar to last year. We did, for some of you may have noticed, we do not have single family housing rehab or sustainability categories this year. And that's because we are seeing a little bit of delay in those projects due to COVID related restrictions. And so those funding pools that were available last year will likely be wrapped up into the facilities and multifamily housing categories. So if you want to take a look at what was available last year, it will be very similar to this coming year.
Thank you. Next question is, can CARES Act funding be used to cover salaries after PPP funds have been expended?
Yes.
Okay. Can you submit one CARES Act RFP that covers activities in more than one of the 5 areas?
I think so. Yeah, we haven't really talked about that, but I've heard a few. I've heard of one organization that is, considering doing something with educational access, digital divide, and child care services. There are ways where they might kind of overlap if you kind of just think about that organically. There are organizations that may be able to provide, here's 3 computer stations for kids that don't have access at home, that they need to be doing virtual schooling, but that might also entail a certain element of childcare services as well. So I would think that there would be some overlap, and that's something, again, we can have technical assistance conversations about too.
Those are all the questions we have in the chat, Michelle. I'm not sure if folks have other questions that they want
Great.
to ask.
We definitely have time. So if there's anyone who has anything else they'd like to talk about. But again, I'll put up the email, our general phone number, and also our webpage. So we'll be posting a lot of our resources on our webpage, the doodle poll, the handbook, the PowerPoint slide, and we'll make these available in ED grants as well. I don't know what just happened. I'll stop sharing.
There's another question, Michelle.
Okay. Is it that to confirm we can apply to each but for different projects?
Yeah.
Yeah, we can apply to each but for different projects. Selena, does that mean apply to each NOFA? Like one for CDBG and one for CARES Act? If that's what you're looking for, then yes. And again, it would keep, just keep in mind that it's your maximum funding thresholds will come into play. So, depending on what you're qualified to apply for in your RFQ, you would be limited. It's a cumulative limit. So, what you apply for under CARES Act or public services in fiscal year 22, all of those projects combined, you would be limited to the maximum funding threshold that you have. And I do want to highlight too for the facility improvements. Oh goodness, I'm going to probably get this wrong, so one of my colleagues is going to have to correct me. But if you have an active capital improvement project right now, your project has to be closed out and completed before you can apply for another capital improvement project at the same location. I think I got that right.
Yeah, it's in our council policy. Yeah, we added that. So yeah, it's in there.
Yeah. So just keep that in mind as well. If you have one going on right now at a certain location, you'll need to make sure that that's closed out and completed before you can do anything else to that facility. All right.
We got another one. For facility improvements, does the nonprofit applicant have to own the land?
That's a good question. No, you don't. You have to have site control, or you have to have a landlord that is willing to allow you to make the improvements on the site. Usually requires a 5-year lease or longer. It also requires a recorded covenant on the property, and so the landlord would have to be willing to record that covenant on the property that would commit to providing services to low and moderate income individuals at that location for at least 5 years from the project completion. And we're not taking on who's asking questions, so don't be afraid to ask questions. I'm not holding it against anyone, so definitely bring them in. And again, if you find that you have a question that comes up after this, feel free to email us, and we will keep answering questions as they come in. But thank you very much for your time. We appreciate your patience as we kind of work through some of the technical issues, and we're still coming up with some of the guidance for the CARES Act NOFA, and it's something that it's new to us as well. So as we learn more, we're able to share more with all of you. And again, we appreciate your time and your willingness to help support the community very much. So with that, I think we can, oh wait, I see another question. Yay.
Yeah, we got one more. Just the start date of the project would be July 1st, 2021, correct?
Correct for the fiscal year 22 NOFA. For the CARES Act, our goal is to, that's actually a really good question. Our goal is to get those funds deployed as quickly as possible. So if we can get approvals and awards awarded, I guess, in January, we could make the contract effective as soon as possible. So it could potentially be, as quickly as we can get a contract executed. That being said, we would likely have longer than a 12-month contract period for those funds. We wouldn't expect you to get the funding award in February and have it spent by June. So we would be looking at, perhaps an effective date of February 1st and have it go all the way through the end of the fiscal year of the following year. So it would be, a little over 12 months. It would be like a 15, 16-month contract. All right. Well, thank you all very much. I appreciate your time, and we look forward to getting all of those requests for qualification responses in. And again, if you don't know if you have redundant, go check.
Yeah.
And thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.